that we have. So please welcome David Simpson, who is the head of the consulting agency InterPraxis that has offices in Canada, in the UK, and in Japan. David has a lot of experience in consulting. He is specialized on the issues of the corporate social responsibility. He's working with the stakeholders, with the sustainability development of the businesses, and the social influence evaluation. As an independent consultant, he has been working with the prominent companies in banking, insurance, investment spheres, and also in the foods industries. I believe that David will introduce himself thoroughly, and he will tell us more about the experience. So, David, the floor is yours, please.
Great, so I'll just unmute this screen here. That's working. And there we go. So everyone can see this, I hope. Thumbs up, there you go, excellent. Welcome everyone, or I should say Доброго dня, a good afternoon for you, and hopefully we're not keeping you away from your cocktail hour in Ukraine. I'm currently joining you from Tokyo, so it's just going into the late evening here. But this is the wonders of the internet, is that we're joining from all points of the globe. So excellent. So this is a little bit new for me. I'm used to more of a kind of back and forth. So we'll see in terms of what this means of an interactive presentation. But please, Tanya assures me that she'll slow us down or take any questions as we go. So a bit of a background just on myself very quickly. So I've been a director in this area within corporate social responsibility or sustainability for 20 years now. And previous before that, a director of an international think tank, a director of standards at a think tank sustainability based in the UK. And then also lead advisor in Canada for the CSR counselor office that has been set up and has had several iterations. I understand that this group is focusing on food and beverage, or particularly in the confectionery area, as I understand. There's some people joining us in the furniture industry, and also the apparel sector and the ICT sector. So fortunately, I have a little bit of experience in all of those areas, and some of those areas I have quite a bit of experience in there, so we can kind of dig in there. When it comes particularly to the SMEs, I'll be also drawing on a lot of experience that I have within South Korea. A number of years ago, they had a number of initiatives to encourage corporate social responsibilities, particularly within the SME sector, and how that's helped them advance their success in that area. So I have a real challenge here. The organizers today, and I want to thank them for inviting me, first of all, they've set out a very large task for me. They say, okay, we want to understand what all of this is all about. We want to lay out a little bit about why this is important. And if you can, let's talk about some of the trends, particularly in Canada. But I'll be probably reflecting a little bit more internationally, because in a globalized market, there's really nothing particular in the Canadian market that we'll be focusing on necessarily. And then if that wasn't enough, we'll take you through a very kind of draft framework of a system of how you actually might start on next week if you wanted to apply some of these things. There's many different recipes or menus for doing this. I'll just be sharing a very quick method with you at the end. So we have a very big program, so I want to take your seatbelt and buckle you in. And again, if you have any questions, just alert that to Tanya, and Tanya, you'll slow me down as we go. So first of all, let me start with a commitment. So my commitment to you is that we'll touch on these three things. So by the end, if we'll have achieved success, we'll have had some definition of social responsibility that we're all understanding. We'll understand the business case at a very high level behind what corporate social responsibility. Give you some updates on some of the latest trends in CSR, and again, learn the basics of a framework of how to implement social responsibility within an SME as you are. So I want to start off with a quick warm-up exercise, and this is really using in the chat box. So if you get the chat box, just pick any company you can think, preferably a well-known company, and just rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is not at all socially responsible and 10 is 100% socially responsible company. I'll just give you kind of a 1.5 minutes to do that in the chat, and I'll have a quick look to see what kind of companies. So the example there is like Volkswagen, and someone might give them a score of 6. So let's see what you come up with here. So I'll just stop the share quickly, and so I can grab the chat room there. People are understanding the chat box, or are they understanding the question? So I'm looking for a company and then a grading on 1 to 10 of how socially responsible you think that is. So Lota has given me a Dove, an 8. JTI 6. Unilever 8. PMI 5. Frank and Oak. That's one I don't know, but Patagonia. Good apparel planner.
Они хотят в баллах оценивать.
General Motors at a even 5. So there you go, Stephen. Good. All right. Kraft, yeah, that's an interesting one. They've taken over some companies as well, Cadbury's, and how that's changed. So some very kind of interesting backgrounds in all those areas as well. There we are. So the point of that exercise is just to give us a sense of what we're thinking about when we talk about what is social responsibility. And sometimes we can have very different kind of scores for what might be the same company there. So, you know, some people picked Patagonia and gave it a very high score. Other people might pick others in a different area. Or even the example here, for example, with Volkswagen, a German car company who possibly in years past with their looking to invest in some of the electronic cars, may have scored very well in terms of social responsibility, and yet with the diesel scandal, when it became apparent that they were lying on some of these tests, we saw that kind of score might have dropped as well. So we all bring our own kind of definition to what social responsibility is. And part of that was a little bit around the reason of internationally of why we needed to define some of these things a little bit more. So what's in a name? And a lot of groups will talk about these groups of corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, sustainability, or we hear a lot lately within the financial markets around environmental, social, and governance, or what they call ESG. So there's a lot of these terms around. For the purposes of today, we're going to use the term social responsibility as encompassing all of these. Some we can, term a little bit differently, but I'm not going to get into the minutiae, into the details of that. And so where does that bring us in terms of some of the responsibilities here? There we go. So a number of years ago, ISO, the International Standards Organization, brought together people from across the world and to essentially define what social responsibility was. And you'll notice here, first of all, the C of corporate is missing, and it's a social responsibility. The idea this also applies to organizations. And so here we have the social responsibility defined, is that it's a responsibility of an organization for the impacts of its decisions, its activities on society and the environment through transparent and ethical behavior. So you have those kind of three elements contained with that. One, you have society or a social element. You have environment or the natural capital. And you have this element also of a kind of ethical behavior more general. And underneath that, you have that this is behavior that needs to contribute to sustainable development, to health and the welfare of society. It has to take into account the expectations of stakeholders, and we'll talk about that later on. It has to, as a starting point at least, be consistent with applicable law, so the laws that apply, you have to at least be following those laws, but it also has to be consistent with international norms of behavior. And this gets quite interesting. For example, in the case of South Africa, at the time, apartheid was very much legal in South Africa, but it was not consistent with international norms of behavior. And so this was, again, taking that as part of the definition. And then finally, we have this notion that it's not something that's bolted on. It's something that's integrated throughout the organization, and it's practiced in its relationships, including its sphere of influence. And so this definition is quite useful in terms of being able to capture a number of points. And this is primarily the definition that I'll be using for today. And again, the EU has one, the Business for Social Responsibility in the US has one, but they're all kind of getting at these same notions. The important thing that we're talking about is that we're not only talking about an organization's charitable giving. It's not only about giving money to a charitable organization or supporting your son's soccer team in that way. Although those may be part of social responsibility, the definition becomes much wider. And really about reducing negative impacts, by the same time amplifying more positive impacts. So when I'm talking with a group of SMEs primarily, it's like, oh great, yes, I've heard of the area of corporate social responsibility, and the first thing we think about is the C, is that it's corporations. It's like, okay, well, that's something that doesn't concern me because I'm not a corporation. I'm just a small or medium business. So this isn't something that applies to me. So the answer here for large corporations, and the answer is very much no. And I think that's something that's very much a part of SMEs tend to be very values-based, and values are at the center. And so they're able to more easily influences the gaps between the rhetoric of what they're talking about in terms of social responsibility and the reality and how to bring that forward. And indeed, SMEs have a bit of an advantage in some areas within the area of social responsibility. Certainly SMEs are more flexible and more adaptable, and they're able to act quickly on new opportunities and take advantage of some niche opportunities. And some of those niche opportunities may be in the area of sustainability. SMEs tend to be very creative and innovative, and I'm sure we'll see that with a number of the people that are in the fashion industry, for example, and bringing that innovation very much to the fore. So they're constantly looking for those efficiencies through creative thinking and championing new ideas in the marketplace. And finally, they tend to be a lot less bureaucratic, right? There's much less levels between the top of the organization and the bottom of the organization. So communication flows much more easily. So there doesn't tend to be, or doesn't necessarily be, these large communication processes that have to happen. It's sometimes a little bit more informal of how it happens. So what are the drivers then of corporate responsibility. And we can really put these into three broad categories. So this answers the question of why, and you're looking at other companies, why are they investing in corporate responsibility? So like a lot of SMEs tend to move into this area of values, this red circle here, because that's where they come from. So when we think of some of the companies like, for example, Hewlett Packard, which was originally started out of the owner's garage. Hewlett Packard was very much an organization that was built on the owner's values. And so they're saying, yeah, we want to contribute to society through what we can bring towards what we do. There may be other organizations that came to corporate responsibility through more pressure, through social pressure. That would be an example of, say, someone like a Shell, when they were, in Nigeria, and some of the original elements of corporate responsibility, where really NGOs or other groups, or Nestle, for example, other groups have really pushed them into area of corporate responsibility, saying we expect more of you and so our expectations are pushing you towards moving towards your responsibility towards society. And then finally, some organizations are here in a more of a strategic approach, is that they see this as part of their business strategy. And that's probably most easily seen within the mining sector, where companies have no choice of where they have to locate. If a particular mineral is in a country, they need to go to that country or that area. And so in order to make sure that they are able to function in that area with the local community, they will strategically invest in corporate responsibility as a part of their business plan in order to make sure that that can be a smooth and kind of seamless transaction. Now, whether that works out or not is not always the case, but that gives you the three broad categories of why organizations are investing in this area of corporate responsibility. So let's move a bit closer now to the business case and making of the business case for CSR. So broadly here, you can go on for a number of areas, but I've decided for the purposes of SMEs, these areas are probably the most relevant. That of operational cost savings, staff recruitment and retention, serving towards competitiveness, and also being a market differentiator for some. Also looking at issues of productivity, that of risk management, and finally, innovation. And then we're also going to add another +1 at the end of this in terms of making the business case that I think will be relevant and for all of you. So let's just start off. So the first one is really around operational cost savings, answering the question, why invest in CSR? And this is really the low-hanging fruit, if you will, because we find that if your aim is you can get greater operational efficiency, you can use less waste, lower cost, and your supplier efficiency can also increase, then it can result in some savings. And so you see in the two case studies at the bottom there, that we see quite significant savings in a lot of these are in terms of in energy costs, or costs that might be towards waste reduction, or in the case of the Sealy mattress company, that they have saved money because of the routing, the delivery routes of their trucks, of their transportation. So you can see that there's real cost savings at the same time as an environmental asset or environmental improvement. And some of the activities we're talking about here may include recycling systems, They might be more energy efficient lighting changes. They may be reducing simple things of just reducing the air conditioner by 1 degree and seeing what savings can come from that. And so there's a number of different things that can be saved there. So that's our first operational cost savings. And here's a quick guide. Oh, this might not work here. Doesn't seem to want to work here. Oh, well, oh, here it is here.
I've been looking over your green proposal.
Great.
It's fine, just fine. I'm sure it'll make people feel real good about the company. Should go over big with the tree huggers, too. See, the folks that I report to, they don't eat granola. So let me ask you, why would I sign this?
This plan could cut our energy costs by 40%.
40%.
And we spent $18 million on energy last year.
What do I sign?
Just sign it.
So there you go.
I've been looking over your green proposal.
Great.
You have the 30-second business case review with an example with IBM. Now, obviously, we're not as big as IBM, and we don't spend $18 million on energy, but you will spend quite a bit on some energy costs, and you can see how you can also turn this into a Walt Disney moment where birds will sing and music will play as you save enormous amounts of money on your environmental and eco-efficiencies. So moving forward from the eco-efficiencies, we'll move on to an area of staff recruitment and retention. And so our aim here is really to attract and retain the talented staff that we have. And this isn't always entirely appreciated by organizations, and particularly SMEs, because they don't have huge human resources departments. They're not counting this. But when we do count some of these things and put an economic cost to attracting talent and retaining talent, these costs can be very significant. In fact, so the average cost to replace an individual employee in one study is about 1/2 to 2 times the person's annual salary. So say you're an SME and you have, say, 100 people working in your organization. With taking the average turnover, which runs at just about 25%, that could equal some 10.4 million Ukrainian hryvnia per year, or equaling some areas of 2.6 million in those areas. So that's, again, quite a significant sum that you're spending in terms of staff recruitment and retention. And so just changing some of those percentages by just a little bit will help you save money in this area as well. And again, we want to attract the best people. If you're working in apparel and you want to attract the best designers, if you're working in furniture, you want to attract the best craftspeople. And as you know, attracting the best good quality people is sometimes very difficult, particularly when you're SMEs and you can't offer the same kind of benefits that some of the larger companies can. But what you can do is offer them more of these kind of values-based organizations, or allowing people to work in a very flexible environments. So some of the activities we're talking about here would be, managing with empathy. What does that mean? Managing as a kind of service leader. So service leadership. Want to make sure that we're treating staff with respect, or that we don't have a manager somewhere that's bullying and yelling at our employees, because we know that's going to increase turnover. We want to focus on issues of gender equality. We want to engage with staff. So how's it going? Are you happy here? What can we make better for you? You don't like the lunchroom? Those type of questions. We want to be open to flexible work. Maybe we'll allow people to work after 10 a.m. or into later hours. everything that we're doing is we're demonstrating our values to our staff so that we know that, so that they know that we respect them. So you have 2 studies here in our case study, which reflects a survey that was conducted in Canada recently, which suggested that 77% of Canadians want to work for companies that have a strong corporate social responsibility program. And added to that is a World Business Council and Sustainable Development study, where a similar number, 75% of employees at organizations that pay attention to environmental protection and sustainable development were able to translate that into higher levels of commitment. And again, that speaks exactly to that area of retention, of staff retention. So this is also quite a significant area for SMEs to benefit from the areas of CSR. Another area is that of being a market differentiator, or focusing a little bit more on this reputation. So most of you, I'm sure, are very used to competing on the issue of quality of your product and the price of your product. And probably 15, 20 years ago, that's primarily where it was in terms of the marketplace, is that you had your quality of your product, maybe it was a little bit more innovative, it did a few more things, and then you had the price, and then that depended almost entirely in terms of what your sale was. But now we have this third area of a kind of non-financial areas of what else is happening in this area where you can compete on these issues. And we're seeing that this is something that you can compete on in this area. As we see in the case study, it was a reputation study that was conducted in 2011, that corporate social responsibility is responsible for more than 40% of a company's reputation. 40%. And when you think, well, what's in the other 60%? That's the products itself often, and then how it kind of markets itself in those areas. So that's a significant area that you don't want to be not competing in that area. You don't want to be missing out in that area. So what can you do in that area? So looking at some of the activities in reputation enhancement, we say, well, you can set your business apart by displaying its values and its contributions to the shared goals of the communities. But what's it doing in the area of the environment? What's it doing in the area of some of these social values? Does it match who I am as a consumer, or who your other businesses? How do your values align here? And really, these can be quite fun, because really these are helping to mirror and reflecting the values of the business owners themselves. And increasingly, we see this as an area, particularly on consumer-facing area. And again, we have most of you in that audience of furniture, food and beverage, confectionery, apparel, and ICT stuff. You're all very close to consumer-facing areas. These are going to be important differentiators for you to enhance in terms of making a sale. So that's all I'll say with that area. Another area is that of productivity increase. It's like, whoa, what's the connection between corporate social responsibility and increasing productivity? So our aim here is really about increasing productivity through enlightened management techniques. And a lot of this I've seen up close. In an example I've used here is an organization in Taiwan who was in the apparel sector. Now, in Asia, in the apparel sector, at least about 10 years ago, we'd see probably most of that. The management was very much top down. And it was about getting employees in from small rural communities. They'd come into the factories, and we would their managers would yell at them. They would bully them and make them to work as hard as they could to get each level of output out of them. But what we saw is that wasn't a very effective management technique. And you probably have your own examples in terms of your own cases in your own factories or where you're doing that. Perhaps that has worked, and in some cases it may still work. We're going to reduce the pay as least as possible, and we're not going to do it. So in this company, is Taiwan-based apparel company, what they said, we're going to try something totally different, and they weren't entirely convinced just at the very beginning. They said, we're going to invest in some more modern management techniques, and we're going to invest in training our workers, and we're going to pay them a little bit more than the least amount, but we're going to retain these workers for a long time. So we have retention, and we're also going to watch their productivity. And so that's exactly what they saw. They had a more cooperative workforce with better skills. They were then able also to get more value-added contracts from their brands and different retailers, and they had good labor relations. So they didn't have the work stoppages that the other organizations would have. They wouldn't have problems where security within the plant would have to break up fights and different things like that as well. So this is another area where we want to look at investing in modern management techniques, invest in training. Look at gender equality in the workplace. So we're creating kind of a fair workplace and an ethical workplace, and that there is a connection that we can see between productivity increases and these more enlightened management techniques. Another one is this better risk management, and we're going to come back to this. So I might go through here fairly quickly. So the aim here is for us as SMEs to really better identify what are the risks that we have here and that we can manage them better. And I should point out is that risk departments are growing exponentially throughout the world. And so this is something that people are looking for a lot more. So again, your retailers or the brands, your business-to-business customers, they already have kind of strong risk departments. And so when they're looking at any sort of partners to do business with, their risk people are involved in that. And they're asking the question, what are the risks? What are the risks doing business with this supplier in the Ukraine? What are the risks doing business with businesses out of China right now? So we're seeing, okay, people are looking at China and saying, ooh, well, our supply chain was really overextended in China. Perhaps we have to look at other areas to move our supply chain around so it's more resilient. That becomes a risk, and we're hearing a lot of that more recently. So some of the activities here will be just, one that management actually is looking down and understanding the risks. Does the organization themselves, do they understand the risks? I want to know that they have a good sense of what's going around. So they have to, be very transparent. I want them to be engaged with their stakeholders, and I want them to identify the most important issues. So maybe if this is too vague, let me bring it down to some things what we're talking about in terms of risks included. So if you're a furniture company and I want to do business with you, I want to make sure that you have good access to resources, your own raw materials, right? So, is that a continuous supply that you have of timber resources or forestry resources that you can turn into a table? Those are important to me. Or, is there a lot of protests in that community where there's going to be a road blockage and I can't get my product out? That's a risk for me and it's a risk for you. What about some negative reputation? What if, and this has happened before where a business decides to have a new supplier and then they find out later that that supplier gets arrested for, say, sexual harassment. Well, that's a big risk now because you're now taking that other organization down. So this becomes very important, and we'll talk about this as we move forward in terms of risk management more generally. The examples here I have is one Canadian example of Joe Fresh Loblaw. This was looking at those in the apparel sector will, of course, know the Rana Plaza incident that happened in Bangladesh. And people then and organizations are now conducting much more due diligence. They're conducting more investigations on their suppliers' environmental, social performance, and they're using a balanced scorecard, right? They're using, so we're not talking about just quality and price. Now there's a big area here on social and environmental performance that becomes also important as well in those areas. And also some banks and some insurance industries are looking at this. Now, I have to say, I haven't seen this a lot, but in the organization that I worked with in Korea, we would see that the government, together with Korean banks, were actually lowering lending costs on loans to SMEs that demonstrated good corporate responsibility. And you go, well, why? Why would they do that? Because they thought that they were less risky for investments or for loans, that they would be better at repaying them back. And we're starting to see some of those areas, probably not as much as we would like, but it's there. And I wouldn't say that that's going to be the case for you in Ukraine. Maybe it's the biggest problem is just getting loans right now. But internationally, we were starting to see some of those things where SMEs are able to access possibly new resources of capital. And also another area is that of innovation, where the aim is really to look at products, how they can be improved, in which ways, and to improve its harmful impacts. And some of the greatest innovations have really been around packaging. So you see 67% of consumers in North America are considering more sustainable packaging a priority or issue when they're shopping. So you might want to look at that. So these are all sorts of experimentation that you're looking at the product itself and saying, how can we be more sustainable? You know, some furniture designers recently were looking at that of how can we recycle some of our wood waste in this area. And so we're saving money, but we're also able to offer this as an environmentally friendly product to consumers who there tends to be some more interest in that as well. So those are kind of things in terms of innovation. And finally, this is the plus. Now, some of you might be familiar with this, what we call the know, like, and trust funnel. This is not only for your businesses, this is for every business. My business is just the same. So what this suggests is that anyone we do business for, first we have to know them. We have to be aware of them. So that's your marketing department. Who are they? But the second part is also that I have to like them. How do I like someone initially? It's usually that I understand their values a little bit more. That, you know, they seem like a nice person, and that they treat, you know, maybe they might treat their staff well. And hey, they're invested in an environmental project that is helping to restore some of the forests in Ukraine. That seems like a nice thing to do. So I like them. And then I need to trust them. And showing trust in terms of that they can perform what I need them to do. So corporate social responsibility can be a real key to this sales funnel. And you know, when they create these funnels, this is what this is how you start. You see at the beginning there where you have these individual customers, and they come through this funnel. And first they get to know you, then they start to like you potentially. Then they say, I can trust this person. Now I'm going to buy. For every transaction, it's the same. And to realize that there's an important element of CSR that can be fit within this sales funnel, I think is important for you to think about as well. And this is, again, particularly in a very crowded marketplace. Now, I'm not the most sophisticated consumer. For me, I still have trouble telling the difference between Coke and Pepsi. For me, they're both brown sugar water. But you know, people, you know, the branding effect, the reputation effect, the individuals, all of that funnels into this buying process in terms of people make a better choice of those things. And so in a crowded marketplace, you need to stand out. You need to look at some of these things as well. So that finishes off essentially our business case in all of those areas. But I can see there's probably a number that are in this, particularly in the SMEs, who are saying, yeah, that's understandable, I understand it, but you know, that seems like something that's still larger companies. And so I've just categorized some kind of, these are the typical excuses in red that we see on the left hand from SMEs of why they don't tend to invest in CSR. So the first is, well, maybe I lack some resources internally. Well, some possibilities in that area is you can build responsibility for CSR into your existing job profiles. Or it may be, they'll say it's too costly. And they'll start with activities here that you can reduce costs. And we've seen areas that can actually help reduce costs. So you don't have to do everything at once. You can pick different areas, particularly as SMEs, that are more important for you. And you'll say, well, look, I'm building tables and chairs. That's our expertise. We don't have an expertise in this area. Well, there's lots of resources that are out there, lots of CSR training. I understand that the CUTIS program itself is also maybe looking to help train some of those areas in that. So, you might take advantage of that as well. And finally, this is what I hear quite often is that my customers aren't asking for it. And so in that area, you say, well, they don't ask for it, but you might want to be more proactive and make it available before they're asking for it. Because you might find out that they actually do care about it, they just might not articulate it the most way. I see some areas in the chat coming up. Is there anything there, Tanya, that, let's see, I need to go through. Oh, anything in particular? Any questions raised at this point? Or did these seem like common obstacles for you?
No, from what we see, there's no questions yet, so we can basically continue. The only question I have, David, have you turned on the subtitles under your presentation? And if you did it, can you please turn it off? Because in Ukrainian version, it's a really weird text keep on coming up.
See. How's that? We're okay.
Yes, right now everything's perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. All right. So moving us on to our top 6 trends for current and future CSR. And I thought we could go through these, at a fairly good pace, and we can see how far we can go. So let's just go. So this will be a quick overview of some of the current trends in Canada and globally around CSR. So number 1 of our top 6 is that CSR is not just philanthropy. And indeed, we have the words of the head of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce most recently, who, and I'm going to quote him here, he says, "For most Canadian businesses, responsible business conduct has moved from doing good to doing right. It's not about philanthropy anymore. It's at the core of their operations." And we've seen that, as we've just seen it within the definition within corporate social responsibility that we're using, is that it encompasses a number of these different areas that include social, environmental, governance, and economic considerations as well. And so we can hopefully dispense with this idea that CSR is just philanthropy. And the very useful thing that the ISO 26000 standard has done is, because that's an international standard that has been adopted by countries throughout the world, is that there's now harmonization on what we're talking about when we talk about CSR. So I think we've advanced that quite a bit. Secondly, in terms of a trend here, is that, and maybe it's always been the case, but it's important to recognize, is that your customers' problems, they're now your problems. So we really need to have a look at what your potential customer is doing in the area of CSR, and then we look to match their priorities. So for example, if I'm a furniture supplier and I'm looking to sell to IKEA, a very good resource for me might be, in addition to knowing about the company, is again the quality, what they're looking for, their specs of their design that they're looking for. IKEA also publishes a corporate social responsibility report every year, and that will give me a good clue into understanding what's important for this organization that I can sell to them. Or you're looking to sell into Pallister furniture into Canada, or other kind of larger kind of retailers. They'll might have things on their website that you could look at, and you can then match your priorities and say that this is an opportunity for us to get involved in my customers' problems to help solve some of those as well. The other thing is that's very useful for as a trend is to look at your business as an outsider. And how do you commonly do that is by discussing with stakeholders, for others that are around your business, and understanding a little bit more about what your risk is. And so, what is your environmental risk? What are your social risks? Often when we work in the business every day, we don't necessarily see that. And so we're becoming more and more a part of our customers' problems now, is that we have to understand them. We have to solve those problems that we didn't necessarily know that was our problem, about 10 years ago, but now they're ours. The third area, and I apologize, this is a bit of a complicated slide right at the very beginning, but a trend that we're seeing is that the legal and compliance issues in these areas are multiplying, and they're multiplying rapidly. This isn't only a particular Canadian experience, but it's certainly an experience that we're seeing more within developed industries or developed countries already. So if I just look at a pretty amazingly at some of the dates from 2010, when we had the California Transparency Act, all up to the 2018, where we had the Australian Modern Slavery Act, which is just coming into implementation this year. And we can see there's a number of different things in these first areas, which all relate to kind of social, labor, human rights, human trafficking elements. So the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, the EU Non-Financial Disclosure Directive, the French Duty Vigilance Law, the Australian Modern Slavery Law. Canada has recently released legislation of a Modern Slavery Act, which is currently in the Senate. Whether it gets passed to become a law is something we don't know yet. But again, the trend is that we're seeing a lot more legislation in this area. We also see the EU, the entire EU, looking at mandatory due diligence in human rights as well. And again, what does this mean to you? Because these are going to be compliance issues for a lot of your large companies that are, that exist in these areas, but they are going to be enhancing their level of scrutiny on suppliers and vendors that in their supply chain, and that will affect you. Other areas here include conflict minerals. So we have the conflict mineral regulations in the EU. We have Dodd-Frank conflict minerals in the US. That might, for example, apply particularly to those in the furniture industry, where you have minerals such as tin, tungsten, and tantalum that can be used in a number of different furniture products. And yet, if you do use these, there's going to be a compliance issues applied to those. And let's not forget, sometimes there's quite large fees and fines associated with some of these as well, or sanctions that could come with your involvement in these areas. In the environmental area, there's of course more national regulatory frameworks for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They might include cap and trade discussions or carbon taxes. Again, these might be something that you're not facing in the Ukraine, but it's important that you know that your customers are facing some of these issues. And finally, on that of governance and issues of anti-corruption, you'll be familiar, of course, with anti-corruption legislation around the world. We've seen this since the US had the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the 1970s. But more recently, we see a lot more countries coming forward with very forceful legislation, including the UK Bribery Act, the Canadian Foreign Protection of Foreign Public Officials Act, the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act in Canada, where this not only can end up in huge, huge fines, $1 million fines to large companies, but also result in them being taken away in handcuffs. So one of the very big concerns around directors' tables right now is certainly making sure that organizations are protecting themselves against issues of corruption and bribery. And then again, you say, well, look, what does that have to do with a company in the US or a company in Canada? It has a lot to do because they are tied to all of their business relations. So if they decide to do business relationship or have any sort of business relationship with your organization in Ukraine or another organization in Latvia or where have you, they have to do a survey or checking to make sure that they're not involved in some of these anti-corruption and anti-bribery issues. Now, if you are already in an area where you can show them that, that can help to de-risk their involvement as well. So there's a lot of legislation adapting in some of these areas. The fourth trend we're seeing, and I kind of alluded to that already, is that we're seeing increased scrutiny in supply chains. Here's an example of a supply chain of a furniture or retailer. So most of you might be in the furniture producers area, but then it goes back to, all these different products, particle board, veneer sheets that might be, or some of the glues that are used. And goes right back to the forest where some of this wood comes. Now there's all sorts of middle people involved and suppliers and subcontractors involved before it gets here. So again, the retailer is not only looking for tier 1 suppliers, they're looking past the tier 1 to who's supplying my suppliers. And they're being increasingly more responsible for that supply chain and making sure that it has good social and environmental compliance in some of those areas. So where do you source from? And traceability is becoming a real issue in this area. A trend that certainly had impact among the larger corporations, but then a lot of SMEs think, well, again, we're too small. Our reputation and brand, what does that mean to me? I mean, when people talk about the brand of a company my size, I think, well, what does that involve? But increasingly, the internet has shown that we really have no place to hide. Social media, people can respond to different things, and this is becoming a bigger area. So you have to make sure that you're covering some of these areas. You're engaging with your stakeholders. You're engaging with people who are complaining about your service that you're offering and stuff like that on a constant level. And perhaps, as I said, perhaps 10 years ago, you didn't have to do that to the same degree. But our environment has changed now to the degree where we have to. So that ethics are now becoming something very much more to the front and center of the buying decision. And again, this is a potential opportunity for SMEs because SMEs have these values that they can make forward and these ethics that can be an important platform on which to show their values to potential buyers. Another trend that we're seeing is an awareness of what we call kind of greenwashing. They'll say greenwashing, or now with the Sustainable Development Goals, they often call it rainbow washing, where a lot of companies will say that they're having a bigger impact, that they're doing all these wonderful things, but really they're not in terms of their performance. And again, this is a trend that we're seeing, is that people are wanting to see much more demonstration of that. So don't tell me only what you're doing. Also, I want to show me what you're doing in those areas. So that we've now to a kind of area where you're going to have more proof of what you're doing in the area of corporate social responsibility. So just to stop very quickly there, see if there's any kind of questions. There's nothing in the chat.
Yes, David, we have one question on Facebook, and the question is, what is the difference between the social entrepreneurship and the companies that introduce the corporate social responsibility?
Yeah, they're very close. I mean, so social, I mean, and again, that's an area where we're trying to define what is social entrepreneurship. You have organizations that are, like B Corps, for example, and B Corps are looking to wear a particular badge of saying that we are good companies. So in the area of B Corps, they're looking to use that as an area of saying, not only are we doing good, but someone has tested me to make sure that I am doing a good job in this area. And so that's certainly an area of corporate responsibility. What social entrepreneurs would also argue is that they're baking it in, they're embedding it into their organization to a degree that it's not something that's separate. It's part of how they run their business. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, so you, at this point in the presentation, you're going, great, so now we have some trends. We've learned a little bit about the definition and why this is such a wonderful idea, but now I've just told you about the importance of show me, so now I have to show you. So the many kind of areas of how do you get from here to there. And the first thing to recognize is that many of you are already doing corporate social responsibility, I'm sure. This isn't something that's entirely new for you. It may mean that we were just adjusting different things. And so one of the things that I want to show here is how do you actually implement something that it becomes a little more formal. And I don't want to scare you by using the word kind of formalized, because I don't think that you need to develop a huge, big program. But you do want to make sure that you have some sort of a system or a roadmap in order to get from here to there. And so that's my intention by introducing this concept of a management system. Now, you already have management systems. It's how you run your business. And so I don't want to get anything, all that so sophisticated or too complex. We don't have to be complex. We can use the same model that you're using for your other management systems in the same way that you do towards corporate social responsibility. And that's using the usual plan, do, check, and act management system that's common to, well, all management systems. So it shouldn't be all that unfamiliar. And what are we looking for in a CSR management system? We're looking for you to enable for you to build on your strengths, right? We don't want to create something new. We want to build on something that's existent, and we want to integrate our CSR with what we're already doing. We want to apply it at both a strategic level, in terms of how can I use CSR from a strategic tool to advance my competitiveness, but also at an operational level. It's like, what does this mean on the factory floor? And we want to provide a clear direction so that we understand it's not only something that's held in our owner's head, because a lot of that happens within SMEs. It's like, oh, where's the manual for that? Oh, it's all up here in my head. So part of this, by institutionalizing, we'll be able to share some of this with our staff so they know, our employees, we share it with our employees so that they know exactly what's expected, and providing a clear direction. And helps to manage stakeholders, because as we've seen, the stakeholders are going to be an important part of this journey as we move from here to there. And ultimately, this isn't about getting perfect performance right out the gate, but it is about continuous improvement. And that's, again, an important part of a management system, of going from a plan, do, check, and act approach. So, and I guess you're going to be able to share these after, I understand, so it wouldn't focus too much because I've just put them out into kind of very simple areas. So on the left hand, we have some of the tasks. So in terms of the planning stage, the first task would really be around that, about conducting a CSR assessment you might want to do. Some of that might include where you're assembling a team together. You look at what the definition is. You understand what the business's legal requirements are. You understand what our value chain is and how you're able to influence others within that. And then you look at what are the processes you have where you can review those internally and say, well, what capacity do we have in order to pull this off? And so in that area, we want to look at moving forward. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. So we'll focus on conducting the CSR assessment. So 2 tools here you have in the planning is, first of all, going back to our ISO 26000 standard where they have our core subjects. I've been talking right now in areas of environmental, social, and governance. Well, they've broken them down into 7 areas. We see these 7 areas or 6 areas come up in almost all of these different frameworks. So they include things like human rights, like labor practices, like fair operating practices, like ethics, for example. Like what are consumer issues that are important to your product? What are environmental considerations? And what about community involvement and development and maybe areas of philanthropy that also fit within that yellow balloon as well. So those become important in terms of how we would start to define what CSR is within an organization, and then start considering what are the implications that my businesses have in each of those balloons. So one of the things that the ISO 26000 standard speaks about is that you can certainly dive deep into any one of these balloons, but that you should probably touch on all of these balloons for all organizations, so that you can't just cherry pick. You can't pick, okay, well, let's see a good example. Well, years ago, McDonald's Corporation would put together their kind of corporate social responsibility reporting. And for many years, they didn't include the fact of where their beef came from. So they had good labor practices, they had good human rights, and they had good environmental practices for their stores, but the supply chain wasn't included. And so that's an area where we say, well, if you're not talking about that, then it's not really a very complete picture. So you want to really understand the organization. And that takes us really to the right-hand side when we're looking at ESG impact pathways. And again, this is just a very quick cheat sheet, really, for you so that you can look at all of these areas of your business and look at, say, are there social responsibility implications to any of these areas? In terms of our own outsourcing or procurement, oh, well, maybe we can use, recycled paper in our invoicing or in our area, or maybe we could use, recycled boards in terms of particle board for furniture. Those are an example of our procurement. Employment, we might say, we're not doing a lot for a lot of, in the Ukraine, there's an issue generally around internally displaced people right now. It's like, well, how are we helping that community? Is this an area where we could engage people, or maybe people with disabilities who find it particularly difficult to find employment? So what can we do in that area? The facilities themselves, are these areas where we can gain some environmental advantages? What about the products that we're developing itself? I was mentioned an example there in the apparel sector. For those now, a new company out of the US is now with some new innovation around a mushroom that is essentially growing a leather-like fabric that people will be able to use in both apparel and furniture use. Well, that's an interesting area where the product innovation has come out of this area in terms of CSR. And of course, resource consumption in all of those areas. So, as you go around this impact pathway, I hope that there's some kind of moments of, aha, we can do different things in those areas. And really at the planning stage, it's really able to step back and to really understand our business and what are areas where we could have an impact, both positively and negatively on those areas. Continuing in the plan stage, then we would look at to say, well, now that we have an understanding of our organization and we've conducted a bit of an assessment of it, we can now look at some of the strategy development of it. And so there we're going to start building support internally if it's a large organization, right? So you want to make sure that maybe, you know, outside of the CEO's office, that some managers are also a part of these discussions. You want to research saying, oh, what are others doing here? What are our competitors doing? Or what are the brands and retailers that we're selling into? What are they doing? Because we want to make sure that we understand that. And here is where you start kind of proposing real actions and activities. So we're going to say, we're going to do that. We're going to actually change the lighting in our factories. Okay, and here we're going to build a business case for it. It's going to cost us this much, and in 3 years, we should be able to make that money back. Okay, and so these are the kind of things where we've actually developed those strategies. An area here I've highlighted is that of deciding on priorities and boundaries and focus areas. Sometimes SMEs find this very difficult because we might say, okay, yeah, what can I do? And someone say, yeah, let's start a recycling program. And say, well, that might not be the important issue for you. And so this tool might help you a little bit more with that. So again, in the planning stage, first of all, on the right hand, we need to consult with some of our stakeholders. And so these are examples where the business is at the core. We have our employees, we have our suppliers, we might have shareholders or owners in the organization. We'll certainly have consumers. Might have government regulators. There may be particular communities of peoples that we want to look at as well, and other business partners. Now, again, this doesn't have to be necessarily formalized, but we might want to start consulting with some of those stakeholders and say, you know, what's important for you in these areas? What's your number one issue in terms of a social environmental issue that is going to be really important to you? And you might learn a lot just through some of those conversations. The other thing is on the left hand, you'll say, well, what is that box? So we have what we call kind of a materiality matrix. And so these are just, essentially it's a box of choosing the most important issues. So where we have some of the stakeholders, they're on the y-axis, and then when we have the business on the x-axis, in terms of what is the significance for the business, keeping the business ongoing. We'll plot that particular issue along the x-axis, and then stakeholders, they might have a different set of priorities, and we can plot those on the y-axis. And where they come together, in the upper quadrant here, that might be the most important area for us to focus on, particularly as we move on. So I'll give you a quick example here, and I've used the example of an apparel sector or a jeans maker. So this actually comes from their social responsibility reporting. And you can see how they've plotted different issues. So, customer satisfaction. This seemed to be quite important to stakeholders and also important to the company. Whereas if I can see, air here, or should be air pollution, well, maybe in the apparel sector, air pollution, maybe that's not the biggest issue. So you can afford to not necessarily look at that. And so that was an area that neither stakeholders outside or to the company, they didn't see that as important, and it didn't seem to be important to the company as well. Now, in the denim area, for example, water is potentially a huge issue, but it's not something that the average stakeholder, a lot of stakeholders have no idea the amount of water it takes to produce denim. But the company, they know, and so the company rated this quite high for them in terms of, yeah, we need to make sure that water is taken care of, because without water, our business has a problem. And so that's an area where the business has taken over, even though it didn't make it so very high up in terms of where stakeholders are. And here's an example of labor conditions and human rights, where that becomes quite important to stakeholders, but maybe, it's also important to the business as well, but maybe they didn't rate it as high as those areas. So again, this is a quick tool. It shows you some examples within the environment, within the social area, and within the governance area of different issues that might be more important in the apparel sector. And so what this would suggest is that those areas that are in the upper right-hand quadrant, so these issues around right here where we see the yellow area, those issues are probably going to be the areas where we want to move on first. So, maybe making sure that our labor conditions and human rights issues, those are going to be very important for our customers. And so we maybe should work in those areas before we are working in deforestation. Now, what do you think? A forestry's company, they would have a very different looking, where this issue of deforestation is going to be much more, I can almost guarantee it'll be closer up here than it will be down here. So it really depends on the organization and how and what it means for you and where you find yourself there. So moving past the plan now to the do part of the program. The do part of the program is we're looking at, well, right now that we want to integrate some of these things. So we want to say, well, what is the business plan we have? And we want to set some goals and set KPIs, because if we don't have any goals, we don't manage this, well then, these are not going to happen, right? These just become nice ideas. Or, what I like to call, sometimes you see these nice ethical messages that are put in factories. They become what I call ethical wall art. And no one really cares about them unless they're being managed and we have some real indicators. And so these key performance indicators, we start developing these and formulating our action plans. There also are opportunity here for us to raise awareness of corporate social responsibility, both internally and externally, and for us to develop those competencies within our workforce. And we want to integrate these within our existing processes and systems and tools. And that sometimes it's just a conversation. You'll be on the factory floor and someone will come up with an idea. Said, like, listen, I hear that we're trying to improve our environmental efficiency. You know what? We throw out a lot of waste product. And I think we can use that waste product in a new way. And here's how. So a lot of those conversations happen, and in some ways, within SMEs, there's more fluid communication, and so they happen more regularly. So, and the third task here is really about integrating that into our daily operations. And then the fourth area of a task is when we start to communicate on that and reporting it. And this has two real goals or objectives. Communications is about keeping us accountable, because we're going to publish some of this information publicly and say, this is how we did. At the same time, it's also about us to show off and to brag a little bit about, hey, this is what we're doing, and we think we're doing a good job in this area. So it has kind of two functions in the do area. So we want to make some of those commitments public. We're engaging with stakeholders here. We're exercising our influence with others in our value chain. And we're looking to enhance the credibility around some of these claims, but it's really around these choosing communications. So first, around implementing some of those goals and KPIs. So I've used the confectionery industry as just an example here, and given us some different initiatives here within the green, red, and blue. So the green is an environmental. Our goal here might be to reduce energy use through more efficient machine or more efficient processes. And our target might be this one, to reduce energy use by 20%. And then how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to collect the energy bills at the end of the year, and we're going to measure them on kilowatt per hour, and we'll see how we're doing. We'll measure that, and hopefully we'll hit that 20% reduction. Okay, and we can publish that as well. Another CSR initiative may be in the social area. It might see, look, a lot of sugar snacks right now. It's being tied to issues around childhood diabetes, a health issue. So we might want to look at issues of, can we reduce the sugar content, or perhaps we can add new areas to our snack portfolio, which would have reduced sugar. And so if this was a goal, then we'd say, okay, well, what are our measures to get there? We'd say, well, what's the percent of our product range dedicated to reduced sugar products? Or in the another area, in the social area and governance area, social area might be to increase youth employment in our area. We say, well, youth unemployment in this particular area in Ukraine is high, and we want to contribute to dealing with that. And so we want to increase our youth employees, or that'll be our KPI target. Maybe we won't put a figure to it right away, but we'll start to measure it and say this is a number or a percentage of young employees that we're employing in our area. And those all become part of your initiatives that you develop and your target setting. The second part, as I was talking about earlier, is around the communication and choosing the type of communications in your communications plan. And again, this doesn't have to be sophisticated. Most of your organizations these days will probably have a website, and you can start putting some of those things on it. And your communications could be simple labels. They might be labels that you have on the store itself, if it's a real store, or it might be on the product. It might be a chalkboard that you inform your employees just internally. It may be a point of sale information. For many years, a number of coffee shops would have a short little note saying that their power is being powered by wind energy. And so those type of things at a point of sales information. Someone mentioned Facebook and some of all the other social media already. You have access to that, and you can use those to communicate what you're doing on your CSR programs, and of course your websites. Example here. This just happened this afternoon. I was out here in Tokyo, and an example of a small business. So here is, I don't know if you can see that in my window. It's probably fairly small right now, but you're seeing this. Anyway, here is a dry cleaner. So a dry cleaner with 2 shops. And you'll see what they have on the very bottom here is they've got their contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And they've listed those out as being number 5, 14, and 11. And so those are the examples here where this small business is saying, this is what we're doing to contribute to those areas. Now, what you have to be clear of, and this is where I now move on to the left-hand side, is that you want to make sure that you're not over-reporting your risk or under-reporting your performance in some areas, so that your actual performance in these areas is matched by your communication, so that as your performance gets better in some of these areas, your communication will probably increase over time. The amount of communications. And so you were really looking for that aligned communications in the green there. If you're over-reporting, saying we're doing all these wonderful things, the risk is that people aren't going to believe you because they know that your performance in the environment doesn't seem to be so good, and yet you keep on telling me that you're an eco label, or you have an environmental that you see that all the time about in websites that say, we really care about our employees, and then you read in the newspaper the next day that they've just fired a bunch of them and stuff like that. So people want to make sure that there's a match between what's actually happening, your activity, and your communication. It's the same in everyday life, right? You want to match your words to your actions, and this is what you want to do to make sure you're implementing your CSR program. And then finally, the check and act stages are really, again, part of a normal process of a plan, do, and check act management system where you're measuring and monitoring your performance because you've already defined your KPIs, or key performance indicators. And you can start to engage with the performance owners of those areas and other stakeholders. It's like, you know what? We didn't meet the energy savings at 20% that I predicted. Why not? Are there areas that we can do more, or if to do more, would we have to spend a lot more? And then so you can have those conversations. So that's part of the monitoring and measuring of your performance. And then of course you want to evaluate and improve your performance. So what are some of these areas where you could improve? Could we do more to engage internally displaced people within Ukraine? You know what? We had a very good experience with that, and maybe we can do more in that area. And we found out very good workers in that area. So that might be an important part for us to look at. are there other areas where we can improve this? And this is part of the continuous improvement part, where we can push some of those goals further to say, how can we get more productivity out of those areas? Just like you would in any other area of quality assurance, or environmental areas, if it's a management system in those areas, or health and safety, similar areas all around. And then of course you go to plan the next cycle. So some concluding thoughts finally here on SMEs. And again, the first thing really is to say that none of this is really new. Most of you probably got into business. Most of the SMEs here have got into business in a way with your values attached. And you live your corporate, or you live your social responsibility values every day in what you do. So I don't want you to think that this is some huge leap for you if you're not currently kind of doing some of these things already. It's more just probably capturing what you're already doing and making it a little bit more formalized in some respects. The second area is that CSR and SMEs are often a lot less formal, as they tend to be more intuitive, and that's completely okay. You don't need to adopt a whole new standard or a new software that someone will try to sell you, or a lot of this is pretty basic stuff. It just needs to be understood in a way that that you're constantly being challenged in a way. And again, taking it through the area where you're looking for constant improvement, that will help you. And also engaging with stakeholders, because they'll also help to guide you in the right way and say, actually, maybe you want to move a little bit further in this area, or move a little bit further in that area. And an important stakeholder is, of course, going to be your potential brands and retailers that you're selling into, because they're already quite advanced in some of these areas. And another added tip is that some of them indeed have budgets to help vendors and suppliers within their supply chains improve their performance. So if you can work with them, they might be able to lend you, some consulting, lend you some systems, lend you some tools in a way that will help you do your work better as well. So that's a quick secret tool for you as well, for you to consider going forward. Obviously, SMEs are not a homogeneous group. They're all very different. You're going to have different concerns. You're going to have different challenges and different priorities. And so it's important that's part of it. And see where different expectations are. As I say, some people within this group, I would imagine those that are in the apparel sector are already have a fairly good sense of some of the expectations in this area, just because the apparel industry is very advanced in some of these areas. Perhaps furniture, a little less so, ICT, the internet, some of the communications in some areas is very well pronounced in terms of privacy, for example, considerations around products. But there's all sorts of new areas that's increasing for us as well. So we want to look at those industry sectors, and there is help within different industry sectors in this area as well for you to look at. So final thing, of course, is that great. So if I practice all these great business cases, I'm going to be a profitable business. Not necessarily. You need to keep your eye. You need to keep your eye on the prize. And if you're not profitable, then you're not going to be useful for anyone. So this is something that you need to embed CSR and make sure that it's going to be profitable for you. But it in itself is not going to make your business instantly more profitable. And of course, I'm sure you already recognize that as well. And finally, I think it's important. There's still a lot of experimentation, particularly around SMEs, because there's a little bit less expected at this point, but that's quickly changing. but there's still a lot of area for experimentation. And so my suggestion here is by learning, by doing, and recognize some of the similarities that between human relationships and business relationships. As I say, it's not rocket science. When you remember again back to that funnel, sales funnel of the, you have to like someone, you have to know someone, you have to like someone, you have to trust someone. And this is the same thing within your business relationship as well. So just taking those human relationships and bringing them into your business relationship. And being humble and focusing on the business as a force for good. I think there's one of my favorite kind of Spanish poets, Antonio Machado, always talks about that paths are made by walking. And so I think I leave you with that thought at the end, is that as you maybe develop your own path, that don't be scared to make some mistakes, and you can always walk back. So that's all I have in terms of a formal kind of presentation. It's a bit odd for me, again, not to have more of an interactive thing, but this is an interesting kind of format. Hopefully we'll have some questions here. And we can see if we've kind of accomplished our mission of defining what social responsibility is in a more kind of universal way, understanding to some degree what the business case is behind CSR. Again, you want to dig deeper in all those areas and understand what it means specifically to your business. What's the business case you can build in those areas? Because some of those examples will be much more relevant than other ones are. Giving you some latest trends on CSR, the kind of 6 check-ins, and finally gave a quick framework in terms of how you might think about systematizing your approach to CSR as you move forward in these areas, and make sure that it is geared towards the business and achieving success in the business all around as a balanced area. So I'll stop there, and I'll stop my share, Tanya, and I don't know if you want to conduct, if that's the plan now, if you want to conduct a short Q&A, or if there is any questions, or we can simply end off.
Дякую, Девід. Було надзвичайно цікаво, дуже цікава презентація.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much for this presentation. We have a question from our gender experts, and she's asking, can you please elaborate on gender equality as the element of the corporate social responsibility? Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Sure. So in terms of being part of CSR or ESG, it's really part of both. And I think we're seeing more of that. There's a tool I have on my website. That mirrors what the UN Women have put up, what they call a WEPs, which are Women Empowerment Principles. And a lot of these are geared to both the human rights considerations, but also in terms of that gender equality is going to be an important part of driving some businesses and part of a business case. I think we've seen that in terms of a lot of opportunities for women to advance in the organization. For example, if they can't see, if they're only going to be in the sewing part of an apparel sector, it's going to be, again, how all of us feel. Oh, I'm never going to be able to be manager or move up in terms of be organizer of this area or a supervisor. Then why should I bother improving my own work productivity? I mean, a lot of these things are just kind of natural at that level. It's not only just gender. It reflects also on, other groups that are marginalized groups as well. Could be different racialized individuals, or within organizations. We talked a little bit about internally displaced people, particularly within Ukraine. All of those things, I think it reflects back on this notion of being fair. And that if we feel that there's a fair opportunity, that it should be fair for all, and that we can contribute to that. Now, the thing is how it's manifested and demonstrated. I think it's manifested, one, that you see it within policies. and that you also see it within processes. For example, we talked about SMEs. They have an opportunity sometimes to offer more flexible workspaces. So you might allow, for example, if a particular individual is saying who needs to take time off to look after a parent, you say, well, we're going to allow that equally for men and females. And if they need to do that, we're gonna allow that. And that person will say, I'm going to stay with this organization because they've been very respectful of me. And you've actually gained a very loyal employee because of that as well. There's a host of different areas. I'll happy to send around a quick tool that SMEs can use as well, just to kind of do a quick assessment of them as well on gender in particular, and gender equality and empowerment.
And as an organizer, I would like to have one question from myself. What are the errors? What are the most common errors for the companies that start to introduce their corporate social responsibility programs?
It's interesting in terms of them, because I think everyone makes different errors in different ways. But I think what I would say is what I have seen is that there's been organizations that wait too long for perfection. So perfection becomes the enemy of the good. I see that with a number of organizations, particularly around SMEs, who they're not quite ready to be about communicating what they're doing in corporate social responsibility. So no, we can't communicate. We want to make sure that we're going to be doing it all right first. And as I say, right now, it's a little lesser with some of the bigger corporations. There's big expectations on the bigger corporations. For on SMEs, I think there's still that area to experiment and for them to get things wrong. And I'm a big believer in failing forward, and and transparency is going to drive a lot of the improvements in these areas. So what I see all the time is that organizations either they won't start moving into this area because they're scared that they're not perfect, or on the other hand, they'll start making claims that they're wonderful because it's someone who is in the mid-level manager who's often writing some of these communications and want to make sure that the boss thinks that they're doing a wonderful job. So they're not going to say, you know what, we wanted to hire 15% more young people in our factory this year. We only got 5%, and here's why. And this is what we learned. I think the mistake is that people either over-report on what they're doing, or they're too hesitant to get into they're too hesitant to put their message out forward.
I think that's all from our side, and I would like to thank David for a great webinar. There was a lot of interesting information voiced out. You've given a lot of practical examples and cases, and I would like to also say to all of our participants that you will receive the presentation and you will receive the videos of this webinar in English and in Ukrainian, and you will be able to study this information once again if you will need to recall it. And I also would like to tell you also that our today's webinar was just the beginning, and we will also have a couple of more interesting webinars on corporate social responsibility. So stay tuned, as they say. On the 17th of August, we will have yet another webinar, and we're about to have a lot of interesting things happening, and we're going to inform you in advance. So please follow us in our social media, follow our website. David, thank you very much once again, and have a pleasant day and pleasant evening, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, thank you so much. It was so interesting. I was in Ukrainian because it was more interesting and more easy to communicate with Ukrainian audience, but it was great. And I
feel sorry for the translator.
No. Because it the very beginning, I couldn't understand what was going on and tried to understand. Maybe it was me who turned on this. But anyway, it was great. Thank you so much. I hope it was also interesting for you. Best wishes from Kiev. I hope one day to see you here, not virtually, but real. And we will be saying you hello in Kiev and maybe to have some great meeting here. So once again, thank you and have a good day.
You're the same. Thank you. Спасибо.
Дякую.
Спасибо.